Thank you to Ideagen for organizing this important series of events on 17 days of sustainability, and particularly for putting a spotlight and bringing in the voices of the world's leading organizations and women leaders around Global Goal 5 during the annual Empowering Women and Girls Summit celebrated October 11th on the International Day of the Girl. As we know, achieving gender equality and empowering all women and girls is a cross-cutting goal to advancing all the SDGs, ending all forms of discrimination against women and girls, and ensuring political, economic, and social equality for women are conditions sine qua non we will not be able to make significant progress for the Sustainable Development Agenda and commitments made by 2030. Alongside the work of government and civil society, the private sector has a key role in driving gender equality. The IFC, the International Finance Corporation, part of the World Bank Group, has been an active driver in this agenda. It is thus my pleasure as a senior legal and gender specialist with the World Bank Group to introduce to you Henriette Kolb, head of the Gender and Economic Inclusion Group at the International Finance Corporation, who will discuss some of current and pressing issues around gender equality and development, new challenges and roles for the private sector. It's a pleasure to have you, Henriette. Henriette leads the Gender and Economic Inclusion Group at the International Finance Corporation, a member of the World Bank Group. She serves as an advocate for gender equality issues in the private sector and works with IFC's clients to include both women and men as entrepreneurs, employees, consumers, community stakeholders, and leaders. She leads a global team that is engaged in co-creating gender-smart private sector solutions through research, investments, advice, and peer learning platforms. Before joining the IFC in September 2013, Henriette was the CEO of the Cherry Blair Foundation for Women, where she remains involved as a senior advisor. Earlier in her career, Henriette was the UN representative in the Middle East Quartet team, advising Tony Blair in Jerusalem. She also worked for the Office of the UN Special Coordinator for the Middle East Peace Process, and she has held positions as governance advisor with the European Commission delegation to Tanzania, the German Technical Cooperation Agency in Germany, and the Friedrich Ebert Foundation in Tanzania, where she worked on conflict reduction, civic education, socioeconomic issues in East Africa. She graduated with a Master's in Development Studies from the School of Oriental and African Studies in London and received her MA from Freiburg University, Germany. She's also a Harvard Kennedy School Women in Public Policy Fellow and a summer and school alumna of Bushers and Hershey and frequent contributor to blogs hosted by the Council on Foreign Relations, Huffington Post, and Business Fights Poverty. Henriette, it is an enormous pleasure to have you here and to have this chat with you on this important topic. I'll start by asking if you can just briefly tell the global audience a bit more about yourself, your role, and the work of the Gender and Economic Inclusion Group at the IFC.
Absolutely, with pleasure. And Paula, thank you so much for hosting our session today. In fact, I'm tuning in here from Washington, D.C., but you can hear from my accent that this is not my natural birthplace. I was born in Germany in the 70s, shall we say. We hide the exact year. And frankly, growing up, at least until the age of 19, 20, I never personally experienced gender discrepancies and differences. Only when I started entering both education and then the labor force was I becoming a lot more aware of what more we can do collectively to close key gender gaps, ranging from all the way from Germany to really the places that we focus on our work on, which is developing countries. The International Finance Corporation, maybe just to set the scene, is the private sector arm of the World Bank. And so we invest in clients and deploy capital and advice to private sector companies in emerging markets to help them employ more people and build sustainable businesses. So as part of that effort, we focus on gender and economic inclusion, meaning we look at where are there differences between male and female participation in the economy and specifically at the firm level, and how can we work with our clients to reduce some of those core gaps. I am so lucky. I feel I have the best job in the world, and I have 70 committed, fabulous people who work with me, and they're working in really tough and challenging countries and markets. So we just last night actually concluded a really interesting conversation with private sector companies in Fiji. Some of you are aware perhaps that Fiji has one of the highest prevalence of gender-based violence, and certainly also has huge challenges around natural disasters and cyclones on top of COVID-19. And yet we have seen the resilience in the private sector and commitment to tackle really difficult topics. And that's what we are all about, is helping clients and partners to work with us on closing key and sticky gaps and making sure that the world becomes a bit more equal.
Excellent. That's a great overview. Thank you for just a little bit of your background and your role. And I'm also lucky to work closely with your team oftentimes, and I know the important work that you're doing. And I think you mentioned a little bit around some of the key barriers, but just working closely with gender equality and development. In your view, what have been some of these important barriers to achieving Goal 5, to achieving gender equality? And how does the World Bank Group work to tackle these barriers? You've mentioned a few, but maybe a little bit more on the work that you're doing.
Certainly, and I would really see the glass before COVID-19, I would describe it as half full in terms of where we are, in terms of barriers and opportunities. Sadly enough, and we'll come to that, and I think in a couple of the next questions, but COVID-19 really threw a spanner into the works in terms of really making it hard to achieve some of the goals we've set to ourselves under SDG 5. So some key barriers that existed before COVID, but also have in some instances been sharpened, is one, which I know you, Paula, have worked really extensively on, is legal frameworks across the world are still very much treating women and men not equal. And in fact, actually, the report that the World Bank Group produces, Women, Business and the Law, shows us how far we are from equality. So in fact, only 10 countries in the world have complete parity when it comes to legal frameworks pertaining to women's economic participation. That is 10 countries. So you can already see there's a lot more work to be done. If we look overall in the number of rights that women have, women globally tend to have 3/4 of the rights than men have. But we all know that, of course, some countries that gap is even larger. And that's where we need to double down on. And we are very, I think, in a good position to do that because with the data around the reforms, and there is some bit of good news. I should mention actually that over the past 2 years, 27 economies took the chance to enact reforms, mainly around pay and parental leave, less around some of the more sticky issues which have to do with property rights and inheritance rights. But there is some progress, but we can accelerate. And we have the means to do though, because we have the data, as I said, but we also have the technical in-house capabilities to then help governments who are willing to reform in doing in a way that it makes sense. And what do I mean by that? Let me just give you one quick example. We've seen that 26 countries around the world are already, for example, asking the private sector to provide childcare support to their working parents. However, a number of those countries are actually pegging that support to the number of women employed, which means that as soon as a company hits perhaps 20 or 50 or 100 women employees, they have to be legally compliant and support childcare. Now, quite a few companies might see this as a perverse incentive in not hiring more women. So that's the type of advice that we at the World Bank Group and the International Finance Corporation can really help governments think through. Second barrier that I can see quite strongly is that in some instances we don't have data. And actually, we oftentimes in the private sector struggle to really get company-specific data that is sex disaggregated. It's a lot easier when you look at employment, right? Mostly companies know, of course, who they employ and by what gender the employees identify as. However, if you look into the supply chains, if you look into the consumers, if you look at the wider community engagements, we usually see stark gender gaps there, and often companies don't measure that, don't assess that, and therefore don't really know where to start in terms of closing some of those gaps. We have made headway, so I want to make it out about solutions. We have in particular worked really hard with the Financial Institutions Group that closes gender gaps when it comes to access to finance, and really they're helping our banks that we invest in to sex disaggregate our portfolio, meaning who are female borrowers, who are male borrowers, to really understand what the data shows them, and then to say, well, we now want to double down in really enlarging and growing our women client portfolio. The third barrier that I can see is very much the business case, and the development case might not be as widely understood, and oftentimes still people view the world perhaps more as a zero-sum game, meaning if you expand opportunities for women, that means less opportunities for men. And we've seen this not to be, bearing out unanimously. And so helping both governments as well as companies better understand why diversity, equity, and inclusion are core business drivers, both at the firm level as well as at the macro level, with strong data points is very key. And last but not least, I would say concentration of power is a barrier to gender equality, because we still see that most leadership positions are predominantly taken by men. And so if you look at, FTSE 500 companies, if you look at our own portfolio at IFC that we invest in, really it's an exception that you see women being the predominant gender at the C-suite or on the board level. So we have long ways to go when it comes to that. And yet better decisions are being made if you have diversity in the boardroom. So let me pause here and just play it back to you, Paula.
Excellent, thank you. And I think you gave a great overview and some of the challenges that we've been working on with the World Bank Group, and I've been involved with as well, and even mentioned, and I think, currently we're dealing with the impacts of COVID-19 and how it's kind of put more pressure on some of these pre-existing issues, and all data showing how it's leading to increasing inequality in many levels, and especially adding to some of the issues that we were monitoring before. I mean, you mentioned childcare, for example. That's been a huge issue for working women, and with schools closed and women having to work remotely or from home. But there are others, and I know that you've been working on some of these issues. So from your perspective, I mean, what have been some key setbacks that the IFC, the World Bank Group, have been monitoring? But also I know that there's recent work that's come out on emerging and innovative private sector responses to the pandemic that support gender equality.
Definitely, Paula. And so just to very briefly summarize some of the challenges that we've seen, and the World Bank Group has put a lot of good data points behind that. One is dropout of women in the labor force has been disproportionately higher compared to men. Some estimated to be almost 1.8% higher than men, others even much, much, much higher. So we still kind of see early trends. Some countries have full data sets, others yet. In fact, in the US, where I'm currently located, of course, we've seen numbers as low as they were 30 years ago when it comes to female labor force participation. And the reason you gave it right there is actually largely related to care responsibilities. That is childcare. At some point, 1.1 billion kids were out of school. And that has impacted often women who are traditionally in most countries around the world shouldering the majority of the care responsibilities. But it has also been elderly care. It's also been being frontline workers in the healthcare sectors. 80% or so are estimated to be women. And so we've seen that additional care responsibility really taking away from paid opportunities. And it's tricky because overall, globally, women already only constituted before the pandemic around 49% of labor force participation, whereas men were about 75%. So we started with a big gap, and it's actually now really increasing. And as I briefly mentioned, that is quite bad for business, but it's also certainly not good for GDP growth at the country level. And so we need to do our level best to re-recruit, retain, and then promote women in the labor force and solve for some of those huge care challenges. And we've been excited. I think Women Business Law and the report there, the latest, showed already some governments taking this issue much more front and center in terms of trying to tackle it. But it really needs, I would very strongly argue, a very strong public commitment. It needs a very strong private sector commitment. And only if those go hand in hand will we really be able to resolve for some of those challenges, and to make childcare affordable and safe. It's not just putting childcare out there. It has to be safe, and it has to be high quality as well as affordable. So there's a long ways to go and tackle that. Then the third part that I wanted to mention is gender-based violence has gone quite significantly up during the pandemic. Reason being, you have less mobility, enormous amount of stress, And of course, also, both on victims and perpetrators being bound together in sort of a home situation or in a more domestic tie-up that leaves very little room to escape. And so we've seen this also play out at the workplace quite significantly. So we've seen an uptick in aggression of customers vis-a-vis providers. We've seen, really huge issues around mental health and challenges there. But, and here comes the good part to that, we've also seen companies massively step up during the pandemic around rapidly accelerating flexible workplace policies, which they might have been reluctant to do so before, instituting much more flexibility and opportunity around parental leave and allowing for more of that in an attempt to retain women and to allow them to continue to do their work. We also have seen companies tackle mental health and gender-based violence quite significantly so. And so these are the types of things that have given us hope. And then if you look at the financial, industry, there we have seen, just again from a really good data point recently, that women's entrepreneurs loans applications have been neglected and rejected twice at the rate of their male counterparts. We've seen women entrepreneurs drastic drops in sales, mainly because they were concentrated more in the service sector, consumer facing, where COVID-19 had a really big impact, education, care services, and so on. So tourism for sure as well. And so that's something that worries us. So as a counter mechanism, what the International Finance Corporation has done is to put together a set of measures that would incentivize our financial institutions that we invest in to, at the minimum, keep the number of women entrepreneurs that are already in their portfolio, but really ideally expand the lending, the insuring, the housing finance, the fintech solutions to make sure that women and men can equally access that. And lastly, I know the World Bank has been very much at the forefront of that, working with governments to make sure that all those COVID-19 support measures can be equally accessed. And we've seen, initial response, for example, when you look at the small and growing business sector, that again, male-led entrepreneurs or male-led enterprises have made more use of governmental support than women entrepreneurs, again, often to do with the care responsibilities that they shoulder. So there's been a lot, but one point I would like to make is obviously digital has been at the forefront of everyone's, mind, in the sense that how rapidly we've seen, both education, health, labor forms, financing has all been accelerated online. But we do need to bear in mind that actually the gender gap online is still very alive. It's about 15% that women are less likely to connect on the internet. And then if you look at usage of the internet for business purposes, even there we've seen a discrepancy. So just saying digital will solve it all in its gender neutral platform, unfortunately, isn't quite cutting it and isn't good enough. And we've seen this bear out in our work on transport and ride sharing with companies around the world. We've seen that bear out in the e-commerce sector. We've just finished some really great work with Jumia and Lazada, both e-commerce platforms, one in Africa and one in Asia, to better understand where are women entrepreneurs on those platforms as sellers, where can they really break into more male-dominated sectors such as electronics, and how has COVID changed that or not? And it has changed it for the worse in terms of, allowing women entrepreneurs to be successful on those platforms, and how can platforms really step in and help women entrepreneurs be equally as successful as their male counterparts. So that's been work that we have been really quite heavily engaged in. And the good part was that governments, as well as the private sector, have been absolutely interested in learning about those types of solutions and deploying them in their respective markets.
Thank you, Henriette. This is excellent, and it's good to know that some of these promising initiatives and thinking about more of solution-oriented approaches, which is, I think, what we all want to hear now and need to focus on. And I think you've already mentioned some of these kind of cross-cutting areas that kind of pressing issues on the global agenda as well. We're talking about climate change, and that's been on one of the most pressing issues. And I know the World Bank Group has been actively working on this and creating new avenues for making sure that this is part of the work that the World Bank Group does in many sectors. You mentioned digital technologies and how that's an area that also, of course, affects in cuts across gender and development and gender-based violence, of course. But wanted to see, I mean, maybe some of these areas a little bit more, or looking at climate change, which is one that I think more recently has been in the limelight. Discussing maybe, you know, the role and some gender responsive approaches for the private sector in addressing these challenges that you've seen coming out of your work.
Yeah, thanks, Paula. And one thing that we've seen is that green investing, right, has really grown as a business over the past 15 years. Green bonds, you know, have significantly scaled. And we are just at a starting point to develop the field of gender lens investing. So there's a lot of learning we can generate from the climate agenda, and also a lot of you know, avoiding some kind of mistakes that have been made, so we don't need to recommit those mistakes. And one thing that I think is very important is to really figure out what are our targets and goals, and how can we collectively build a field that is successful in reaching them. And there I've seen you know, efforts being put together by, for example, the 2X Collaborative, which is a fantastic set of collaborators and investors, currently mostly public financial institutions, that come together to say we really want to expand our gender lens investment footprint. And deploying all kinds of financial instruments. IFC has done some great work around debt, but there's more, and we've done some very pivotal and innovative gender bonds, but there's so much more we can do in that space. So I would say learning from the toolbox from climate in terms of diversity of investment instruments, but then going even one step further, and I think climate advocates would agree with me there. It's one thing is the capital, but the other is the technical advice and the technical capacity building. And that's something we've strongly, you know, understood in our work with Banking on Women is, yes, a credit line is being deployed and comes and goes, but if you don't retool your business approaches and you don't uncover the unconscious, or in some cases conscious biases, then you really don't sustainably change how the market, the sector, the industry, and that firm is operating. So it requires really sort of both the capital and the capacity approach, I would say. Also, we've seen, you know, massive growth on interest in social bonds and sustainability themed linked bonds that obviously investors come to us for. And so getting clarity over how can you then integrate gender dimensions into those, which have climate dimensions, governance dimensions, as well as gender and other inclusion dimensions, so that it still is watertight and makes sense, and that the use of proceeds are being deployed to causes and rational and with an end goal in mind that can be clearly measured, is very important. So we don't run the gamut of, you know, perhaps pinkwashing or just sprinkling gender here and there to make us look and feel good. That's not what this is about. This is really about being quite rigorous, having the data points, and then putting forward, you know, a really very interesting set of investments for our investors as part of this bond structure. We are working hard on that. In fact, stay tuned. Actually, we are launching a paper that looks at social bond structures and opportunities to utilize them to close key gender gaps. So that we will reveal during the annual meeting, so in just a couple of weeks. But it's certainly something we're very eager to doing more of.
Thank you so much. I think we've touched on, you know, a number of issues, and all very pressing and cutting across the gender and development agenda, which is ultimately the goal 5 of the Sustainable Development Agenda. And I wanted to just conclude asking from you, you know, if you kind of have to suggest 3 key lessons from your experience and the work that have the potential to accelerate the progress of Global Goal 5 and gender equality. What would you leave for the audience?
It's probably been tried and tested, but be the change you want to see. And what I mean by that is that our own institutions have to live and inhabit the values that we then engage with in the business practice with our clients. So, for example, we are asking our clients to procure more from women entrepreneurs, but we were only able to credibly engage in that type of work because the World Bank Group itself looked at its own procurement and said, here's how much we're procuring from women entrepreneurs. And a few years back, that was only 3.7% of our spend was going to women entrepreneurs. I'm not airing dirty laundry. In fact, it's even slightly better than the global corporations, which airs about 2% on spend from women entrepreneurs. However, it's certainly not good enough. And we recognize then that let's double that and let's hold ourselves accountable. So walking the talk is absolutely crucial. Otherwise, it really rings hollow when we go to the market and ask some of these things from our clients as an investor. So second point is, and I briefly mentioned it, is data. Without data, you have a very weak case of tailoring solutions. Data upfront, and we are very good at that, measuring some of the key gender gaps and giving ideas around how we can close them. But then the data journey continues. You then need to make sure that when you start the programming, whether you're actually closing these gender gaps, and at the end of the program, have you achieved what you would say you wanted to do? And I think there's collectively in the community more work that can be done, and the Center for Global Development and others are very keen on really working on measuring women's economic empowerment, and Gates Foundation and others. So we're not alone there. It's good to know, and we have very strong partnerships in that space. And then the third dimension I would say is to try things out and to innovate. So a couple of years back, I'd say most of our work in the International Finance Corporation was focused around women entrepreneurs, and that's critical. And it was mostly focused around credit. And there is a 1.5 trillion credit gap for women entrepreneurs, so we should keep on doing that. But there's so many other things that women entrepreneurs do need to grow their business. And so looking to innovate constantly in terms of what else can we offer the market. And there, for example, we've done some really interesting work around housing finance and helping our clients understand affordable housing and gender dimension, how they go hand in hand. And we've just done our first deal last year in Panama, where we focused our lending on women as asset owners and household owners. And so that's the type of stuff that needs to happen more of, is really uncovering the untold story with unusual alliances and make it stick in the market. So I would say thirdly is continue to being innovative and growth and forward-looking.
Excellent, thank you. I think that was a great way to conclude this, and I agree, and I think the audience would agree that innovation and having a forward-looking agenda and I think a solution-oriented agenda is the key way to go. It's been a pleasure talking to you. Thank you for your work as head of the Gender and Economic Inclusion Group at the IFC, the private sector arm of the World Bank Group, for the amazing work and innovation that you've brought to this agenda. And I'll tell the audience to also look forward to the new analyses and recommendations that are coming out, and to look for the work on the webpage. And there's some excellent material, some of the things that you discussed, and I know that the IFC continues to work on. So thank you again, and thank you to Ideagen for hosting this chat, and for leading the work also on highlighting these issues for the global audience.
My